Welcome to the Ukraine War Monitor. The Ukraine conflict has been ongoing for nearly a decade, with more than 13,000 people killed and millions displaced. While much attention has been focused on the military and political aspects of the conflict, the impact on civilians has been devastating and often overlooked. In this video, we will explore the untold impact of the Ukraine war on civilians. Displacement of civilians. The displacement of millions of people is one of the most significant impacts of the war on civilians. According to the United Nations, more than 1.4 million people have been displaced within Ukraine, while another 1.6 million have fled to neighboring countries. These people have had to leave behind their homes, communities, and often their livelihoods. They are often forced to live in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions with limited access to the basic necessities such as food, water, and medical care. Children who have been displaced by the conflict are particularly vulnerable, as they may have missed out on years of education. Their mental health has also been affected, as many have experienced trauma, anxiety, and depression as a result of their displacement. Destruction of infrastructure and public services. The destruction of infrastructure and public services has been another major impact of the Ukraine war on civilians. Homes, schools, hospitals, and other essential services have been damaged or destroyed by the conflict. This has made it difficult for civilians to access basic necessities such as food, water, and medical care. In addition, the destruction of infrastructure has had a long-term impact on the economy, making it more difficult for Ukraine to recover from the conflict. Many people living in areas affected by the conflict have been left without access to electricity, heating, or clean water, which has further increased their vulnerability. Humanitarian crisis. The displacement of civilians and destruction of infrastructure has resulted in a humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. The conflict has left many civilians without access to basic necessities, such as food, water, and medical care. According to the United Nations, more than 3 million people in Ukraine are in need of humanitarian assistance. The crisis has been particularly acute in areas near the front lines of the conflict, where access to aid is limited due to security concerns. The humanitarian crisis has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has made it more difficult to deliver aid and provide essential services to those in need. Impact on children. The impact of the Ukraine war on children has been particularly devastating. Children have been displaced, traumatized, and forced to miss out on years of education. The conflict has disrupted the education system, with many schools damaged or destroyed, and teachers and students forced to flee their homes. This has left many children without access to education, which could have long-term consequences for their future prospects. The conflict has also had a psychological impact on children, with many experiencing anxiety, depression, and trauma as a result of their experiences. Children who have been displaced by the conflict are also at risk of exploitation and abuse, which further increases their vulnerability. Economic impact. The Ukraine war has had a significant impact on the country's economy. The conflict has damaged infrastructure, disrupted trade, and caused businesses to close or move elsewhere. The conflict has also resulted in a significant decrease in foreign investment, as companies are hesitant to invest in a country that is experiencing ongoing conflict. This has led to a decrease in jobs and a rise in unemployment, particularly in areas affected by the conflict. The economic impact of the conflict has been particularly harsh on vulnerable populations, such as the elderly and those with disabilities. The conflict has also led to an increase in poverty and inequality in Ukraine. Psychological impact. The Ukraine war has had a significant psychological impact on civilians, particularly those who have experienced violence or been displaced. The conflict has led to high levels of stress, anxiety, depression, and trauma among the population. Many people have lost loved ones or witnessed violence, which can lead to long-term psychological damage. The ongoing nature of the conflict also creates a sense of uncertainty and fear, which can lead to a range of mental health issues. Studies have shown that the psychological impact of the conflict is particularly acute for women, who may experience gender-based violence, sexual harassment, and discrimination. Human rights violations. The Ukraine war has led to a range of human rights violations, including extrajudicial killings, torture, and enforced disappearances. Both sides of the conflict have been accused of committing human rights abuses, including targeting civilians and minority groups. The conflict has also led to a rise in hate speech and discrimination, particularly against those perceived as being on the opposite side of the conflict. Humanitarian organizations have documented cases of arbitrary detention, forced labor, and other forms of exploitation. The human rights violations that have occurred during the conflict have had a lasting impact on the country and its people. Impact on women and children. Women and children have been particularly affected by the Ukraine war. Women have faced increased levels of gender-based violence, sexual harassment, and discrimination. The conflict has also disrupted essential services such as healthcare, leaving women and children vulnerable to preventable diseases and complications during pregnancy and childbirth. Children have been forced to live in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, with limited access to education, healthcare, and other essential services. They are also at risk of exploitation, abuse, and recruitment by armed groups. International response. The Ukraine conflict has received a significant amount of attention from the international community, with many countries and organizations providing humanitarian assistance and support. The United Nations has been actively involved in the conflict and promoting peace talks between the two sides. The European Union has also played a significant role, providing financial and humanitarian support to those affected by the conflict. However, despite these efforts, the conflict has continued, and the humanitarian situation in Ukraine remains dire. Displacement and refugee crisis. The Ukraine war has led to one of the largest displacement crises in Europe since World War II. Millions of people have been forced to flee their homes, seeking refuge in other parts of Ukraine or neighboring countries. The displacement crisis has put significant pressure on host communities, with limited resources and infrastructure to support those in need. Those who have been displaced face a range of challenges, including limited access to healthcare, education, and employment opportunities. Impact on education. The Ukraine war has had a significant impact on education, with many schools and universities closed or destroyed. Children and young people have been forced to miss out on education, putting them at a disadvantage for the future. The disruption to education has also had long-term economic implications, with a potential loss of human capital for the country. The conflict has also had a significant impact on academic freedom, with scholars and students facing restrictions on their research and expression. Environmental impact. The Ukraine war has had a significant impact on the environment, with the conflict leading to the destruction of forests, contamination of water sources, and damage to ecosystems. The conflict has also resulted in the release of hazardous materials, including heavy metals and radiation, which pose a significant risk to human health and the environment. The environmental impact of the conflict is likely to have long-term consequences for the region, affecting both the health of the population and the viability of the agricultural sector. In conclusion, the impact of the Ukraine war on civilians has been devastating and far-reaching. The conflict has resulted in the displacement of millions of people, the destruction of infrastructure and public services, a humanitarian crisis, and a significant economic impact. The psychological impact of the conflict has been particularly severe, with many civilians experiencing anxiety, depression, and trauma. It is important to continue to raise awareness of the impact of the conflict on civilians and work towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict. If you found this video informative, please consider subscribing to the Ukraine War Monitor channel for more updates and analysis on the ongoing conflict. Don't forget to like and comment below with your thoughts and opinions on the topic. Your engagement helps us create more content that educates and informs our audience. Thank you for your support.